Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. My name is Tim O'Reilly. I'm with Backyard ADUs, and we're really lucky to have Thor Akerley here tonight, as well as Michael Robbins. The goal tonight is to sort of pause and look back at a year of the Affordable Homes Act. What's actually changed? What are we seeing out in the field across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts? So thank you, Thor. Thank you, Mike. A quick intro for you, Thor. Thor's got more than 6 years of experience across the board, both designing septics as well as a professional wetland scientist, being out in the field, conducting reports, going to hearings, and you're a wealth of knowledge and experience, Thor. So it's always great to see you, and thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Michael is an attorney with over 23 years of experience in real estate, providing expertise in several states with complicated residential and commercial matters. So thank you, Michael, for coming tonight.
Absolutely. I'm excited to be here.
So I outlined earlier before we recorded, but I'll reiterate, the goal tonight is to sort of hit 3 different parts. One, let's talk about the rules. How impactful was this change? What are we seeing? What are some challenges? Part 2, we're going to turn and look at a common challenge for those on septic systems, and what is the DEP guidance? And then Thor, I'll poke you a little bit as well on maybe storm water and conservation, and what are other things that we're seeing in terms of ADU production. And then the part 3 is we'll sort of look ahead to the future and grill you guys about what you're seeing. And then I've got some data as well about what we're seeing on the West Coast, as well as here in New England about ADU change. So to kick it off, the Affordable Homes Act, Mike, you and I have been on another webinar and also several speaking engagements across the state talking about how impactful these rules are. Tonight, we're not going to dive into the specifics, but you can turn back and look at one of our past webinars detailing the specifics of the Affordable Home Act. But to kick us off, Mike, maybe you could just start for us. What are some of those big significant changes, and how have you seen those unfold across the state in the past?
Yeah, so thanks so much, Tim. So I try to put this into perspective. So I've been doing real estate conveyance and practice law almost exclusively for 23 years. So like land use issue, developments, building, zoning, permitting, this change to the accessory dwelling units law and its implementation is the largest top-down, what I would refer to as zoning change in my 23 years. So this is the biggest decision that's going to come down, that's really changed the fundamental aspect of how accessory dwelling units are referred to, how they are permitted, and the implementation of such permitting. And so that's how big a change this is. It's hard for some people to understand, but for me and my seat that does this on a daily basis, this is seismic. I'm on my town zoning board of appeals, so these are waters that I swim in, and it is a fundamental change. So what it's done is it's enabled homeowners to build an accessory dwelling unit. And it's just important to use the correct language, because previously these would be called granny flats or in-law suites. And what's happening is we are changing that definition to an accessory dwelling unit. The key part of that term, so an ADU, is accessory. It has to be accessory to the primary dwelling. And so what happens is now an ADU in most sets of circumstances is going to be allowed by right. And the seismic difference is previously that was not the case. So previously, Tim, if you would wanted to build an in-law suite, an AD, now called an ADU, you would go to your town's building department. They would deny you a building permit. You would then have to go seek a special permit from your town's zoning board of appeals. You would have to notify your abutters. You would have to essentially ask for permission from your town zoning board of appeals. They could deny you, they could put conditions on your approval. And for the largest, easiest way I can get into this format is those requirements have been now, for the most part, largely set aside. So that's the big shift. So now in your, depending on your town, depending on the type of project you're doing, with some provisos there, so what's going to happen, Tim, is you go to your building department and you get a building permit. You might need what's called a site plan review in certain towns and certain circumstances, but now they really can't deny you that building permit. And
That's great.
that's
Yeah.
the biggest change. So it's before you're asking for permission, now you're exercising that right. But you and I both know the devil is in the implementation and those details.
The devil's always in the details. And maybe I'll, sitting on your local zoning board of appeals, now ADU projects probably don't come in front of you. Has that been a real change you've seen both personally in your town?
Oh, I love it because I'm a pro property rights. I'm a property rights attorney. I just believe in property rights as a principle. And I live in Southborough, Massachusetts, and there was a real effort to try to curtail ADUs from the local level as much as possible, and that got shot down at town meeting. And so we have the broadest set of rules currently allowed under the Commonwealth. Now, towns can add and change their bylaws to make their bylaws more permissive and more expansive. So reducing side setbacks for detached ADUs, or enlarging maximum structure size, but they can't be more restrictive. So towns can be more permissive, but they can't be more restrictive. And so Southborough, for example, has the most restrictive, least restrictive laws allowed under the Commonwealth. So
and that's what we've seen too across the board is people inquire in towns all across Massachusetts. And our first step is go in there and read the rules.
That's it. Imagine that.
Update them from last August, to this August. And most towns, and correct me if you were seeing otherwise, Mike, but most people's towns seem to have just fallen in line. They've taken that language direct from the state and said, great, we're going to copy it, paste it in.
I'm curious. So this is where these type of calls are so great for me, because I want to hear because I'm kind of in the ivory tower to a greater or lesser degree. I'm always curious as to how implementation is being applied. I know, for example, in the town of Leominster, there was an issue where they're like, oh, no. And then they get shown the law and they go, okay. So implementation is still being figured out. And then, as you and I have discussed in a couple circumstances, towns are then, trying to add additional fees and costs. And then it's just the arguments and the pushback. And so I'm always curious about if there's people on the call who've had any personal experience on this, but it's certain towns are leaning forward on this and other towns are really fighting back. And sometimes there's really good reason. The issue with the laws, they're very broad. You and I have kind of discussed some of the language that I think it's section 773C. Don't worry about it, people. But it says yes and no in the same provision. No, you can't unless you need to. That's like, okay. But it's a situation where the law applies to all cities and towns in the Commonwealth. And so what happens is there are some good reasons for some pushback. Some are less honest about it. And that's what we all have to work and figure out.
And that's a great segue. I wanted to tee off talking about who's really challenged or circumstances where it's either a town, head on not wanting to accept those rules, or layering in challenges or sort of roadblocks while also being in compliance. But first, I did just want to add that the site plan review, which you brought up, is something that we're seeing as well. Certain towns who've maybe been always having the control not wanting to give that by right experience and open the floodgates and implement that intermediary step of site plan review. And it's actually right in your neck of the woods. Northborough is one where they've implemented site plan review. We've now done it 2 or 3 times. The first time it was pulling teeth. Every department in that town had something to say. We had a very formal meeting. We discussed a lot of points. We talked through a lot of stuff. Everything went swimmingly. The next one, a lot. They knew what to expect. They knew this was by right, what the rules were. It probably took 15 minutes. And then on the next one, they said, oh, we'll do this on Zoom. You guys don't need to come in person. We'll hop on a Zoom. Everyone will be on.
There we go.
Take 10 or 15 minutes. The town retains their control, their ability for all those departments to see and stamp and approve it. And then, you know, in this case, we were building it, or if another builder or a homeowner wanted to navigate that themselves, they would be able to, and hopefully a much more streamlined way. So I wanted to add that note about site plan review, that it's not necessarily, you know, free and clear with the building department, depending on your town.
That's it.
I've also seen other towns who used to have site plan review just get rid of it. They said, hey, now at the state level, in theory, this can just be by right. Let's get rid of this site plan. We'll add maybe a couple more
I think in the spring, a lot of towns, most towns, they, you know, it's a slow process to amend. Typically, you know, they have to go through, most towns use a warrant publication of new rules, and I think a lot of towns are looking for the spring to make some amendments. What I hear from a couple of my communities that I kind of work within pretty predominantly is site plan review only for detached ADUs.
Interesting.
You know, anything else, they're just going to let it go.
Is there a rationale you think for that?
I think the biggest concern is overall development, density. I think density is honestly, like, so you and I have discussed Shrewsbury, for example. Shrewsbury's already, for a, you know, a town of that size, a pretty densely populated, pretty small lot size. And so adding, you know, detached ADUs to pretty small lots to, you know, pretty restrictive circumstances, you know, Shrewsbury is going to have some real pains, whether it's a school issue and then capacity for infrastructure. So there are real issues. I just don't think a lot of towns are necessarily being honest about it.
Interesting. There's a great question from the audience, from Mila. She's asking, I believe that one of the requirements for making an ADU, for an example, in the basement, is to have a 7-foot minimum ceiling height. Is there a way to get an exemption for that? Something like house age, etc. And I'll just add a caveat to that, is building code. You know, we're talking here the Affordable Homes Act. This is across the board a zoning change. And is there anything you're seeing out there in terms of building code or those requirements?
And that's the thing that I think probably Tim and Mila, this is the challenge that I have. And this, I honestly, as a practitioner, I can't wait for the day when AI handles these questions for towns and enforcement of building codes and applications, because it'll be more uniform and more evenly applied. What I dislike to this day is Town A says that we'll make an exception. Oh, it's a ranch based on this size. We're not going to require, you know, for a pre-existing non-conforming home, and I'm going to say non-conforming with respect to ceiling height in the basement, we're not going to require you to dig out additional spaces. Some building departments and building commissioners will allow for that. Others will not. And that's the thing that I don't like, is we're going to enforce it here, we're not going to enforce it there. So the answer for you is I don't know. And I think I found in my profession, it is really easy for these towns to say no by phone or by email or by letter. When you go in and say, listen, I want to try to meet with you and talk to you, explain this to me like I'm 5 years old. Like, so what you're doing is you're saying I can't build an ADU. You want me to dig out my basement? Like, is that fair? Is that equitable? Is that a reasonable set of circumstances? Again, if it's, you know, a couple inches off, I think that there's some gray area there. If if you have to bend down to live in the unit, that's just not going to fly. So,
Right. The crawl space ADU will never.
yeah, the crawl space ADU, and they'll be like, well, my mom's only 5'2", and that's just not going to cut it.
Yeah. And I don't want to sort of tip my hand of what I think looking into the crystal ball of the future, but these sort of challenges that will come up over the next couple of years, these barriers to why more housing can't be produced, will get addressed with future iterations of ADU rules across.
I think so too.
Yeah.
I think so too. And because the code needs to kind of catch up to this. And again, like, these are things that don't, you and I have joked about this on some of these calls. Like, a garage door is not an entry door for, like, that's not a doorway. And a bulkhead door is an illegal form of egress. And it's just like, what? Like, things that just don't make sense. So,
And I like looking again to other communities. California has recently basically paused changes to building code because those building codes also do change. And sometimes those changes, hey, I now have to be in compliance with X, Y, and Z, may prohibit, or it makes it more challenging to build more housing. So Mike, I danced around it, but this is sort of the meat and potatoes I wanted to dive in with you on.
all right.
Where have you seen challenges to those rules? And Thor, there are some great questions in the chat for you about wetlands and conservation. So coming up soon.
What towns have I received phone calls on? Is that a more pointed question?
Yes, and maybe to like what parts of the Affordable Homes Act?
I think that's the better question, because I have not received a ton of calls. I think the things that are coming up with, one is the addition of additional requirements for tie-in fees. So under the law, it specifically states that towns can't add on fees essentially to add on fees. They have to be reasonable under what's called the reasonable standard. They just can't add on tie-in fees to add on tie-in fees. And I want to kind of go into those details in just a second, but the tie-in fees, and like a new one is, we're going to require fire suppression, which means sprinkler system. So, oh, you want to build an ADU, we're going to require fire suppression. I don't think that's going to pass legal muster. I think because that's just patently on its face just an unreasonable, arbitrary, and capricious cost. So if I want to build a new house, nowhere in Mass Building Code to build a new home are you required to have fire suppression. So the idea that you would have to be required to have fire suppression for your ADU is just patently, that's not going to hold a cup of water. But that's a real, those are real examples of towns adding in, oh, it's for safety. And the other is water and sewer tie-in fees. And, I've seen towns want to say you need a separate connection for an attached, let's say a converted basement unit. We want an additional line for that. And it's like, what? Like, and a lot of times the lines might be, under capacity. And so there might be a reason to upgrade the water capacity. Or if it's a detached project, if it's a detached ADU, I use my ADU as an example. It didn't make sense for, I don't have town water, town sewer, but for my water line, it just didn't make sense for me to have the water line that because it's just offset. It doesn't make sense. But literally, like, these towns are requiring, mass excavation for like 6 feet. They're like, oh no, it needs to run across the side of the house. then down and over, as opposed to just tying into the back of the house, like do the plumbing through the house and it's 6 feet. And they're saying, oh no, we need a separate connection for that. And one of the arguments that they're like, well, the property owner, if they rent it out, they could turn the water off as like a penalty for the tenant. And like it's a safety issue, because if the water gets cut off for the main house, then the other unit could get cut off, and that's unequitable to the tenant. And I go, well, this is an accessory unit. It's not a second structure. You know, you can call it anything you want, but by law, it's an accessory structure to the primary dwelling. And so it shouldn't be labeled as anything different. And oh, by the way, if the landlord cuts off the water to that unit, they've got housing violations for that. So they can't do it anyways. But these are the excuses that the towns are making.
Yeah, and there Shrewsbury is that example to say, hey, we're requiring separate water, separate sewer to the tune of $15,000 to $20,000 in infrastructure work, which was a project we were working on, and it's no longer a project we're working on, largely because of those costs, which the Affordable Homes Act calls out and says, hey, you cannot have undue, unjust, cause for that. So Shrewsbury, were there others that you've heard of that are?
Oh my gosh, I want to say
But
you caught me on the spot. I have a few I'd have to check. So if anyone on the call is having issues, I would love to hear from them if they've applied, what their process is like. Because again, I own, whether it's a good story or not, if they're having success or pluses, minuses, anything. Because no one calls me with good news, Tim. 100%, 100% of my calls, it's amazing, are all bad news. So,
and folks like yourself, you and others, being advocates in this space is very helpful for homeowners. And I'll also plug and say that the Attorney General in Massachusetts is also doing this, is saying, hey, where are towns, because it is happening, not in compliance with these rules, either, blatantly or maybe, more subversely, with requirements that aren't fully up to stuff. And then there is good news. There is good news that, and you mentioned to it earlier, Mike, that towns are allowing more progressive rules, saying, hey, 900 square feet, you can go bigger.
That's right.
Yeah, we're building a couple right now. One is 1,500 square feet in Harvard, Massachusetts, and they say you can do that. In Concord and Lexington, some of those towns more in Metro West, you have to go and get a special permit, but they'll let you build, 1,000 square feet. And I've heard other towns who are saying, hey, we're going to allow for 1,200 square feet. The rationale we normally hear for that is, well, who's moving into a lot of these? It's a lot of aging in place scenarios. And we want, more space for accessible features, and that folks who are going to live in this house have the ability to live in that space for as long as possible.
That's it.
That's
it. That's the largest. It's, the concern is just the overdevelopment of them.
Great. Thanks, Mike. Thor, I want to turn to you here, because a lot of projects, we have a lot of towns with sewers, but there are a lot on septics, and the DEP published their guidance to say, hey, this is how we're going to treat ADUs on septic systems in the state as it relates to the Affordable Homes Act. And it's been, 5 months here since that. So what have you, maybe give us a quick rundown and what you've been seeing on your end?
Yeah, DEP issued about a 5-letter or 5-page document summarizing essentially the current regulations of Title V, but highlighted some points in Title V that were common misconceptions, and have been treated differently across many communities historically. Most importantly, what we've seen is that, in one project you came to us on, Tim, was the Harvard project, where people want to build an ADU and they say, hey, can we just build a new septic system just for the ADU? And the answer isn't always straightforward. DEP essentially considers the entire property the facility, in quotes. So any increase in flow to any part of that facility constitutes any septic system on the property being required to meet new construction standards for Title V. That means a couple of things. If you have an existing dwelling with a system that was designed and installed before Title V rolled over and changed around 1995, if you were to build that new system for the ADU, the existing system would also need to fully be replaced with a new system in full compliance with Title V. So because of the way Title V is worded, any increase in flow makes you or kicks you over to new construction. That being said, there are cases where you will have a septic system serving a primary dwelling, and the system was designed in full compliance with Title V, let's say in 2000, installed in 2000 or so, and you could build a separate septic system for that ADU. In most cases, people have systems pre-1995, and the easiest path in our experience is to replace both systems, or I'm sorry, just design one system for both the ADU and for the primary dwelling. But in many communities, that's not possible, especially if you live on the North Shore, where I do, Gloucester, Rockport. It is tough to meet new construction standards up here. But in many communities in the west central regions of Massachusetts, it is much more feasible. So that's really the highlight. I would say for homeowners, we have seen examples too of people over designing systems when they're replaced, or just going ahead and saying, hey, let's meet full Title V. We had another project in Lexington where the property owner intended to do something down the road. So when they installed their system in 2009 or so, they over-designed it as a 5-bedroom system, fully met Title V's requirements, with the plan of potentially building an ADU in the future to add a couple extra bedrooms via that ADU. So that's really the big picture of septic and how the state is viewing them. The other component of it is that anytime you're building an ADU, it makes the property not just a single family dwelling. So you do have to use a 2-compartment septic tank. So even if you meet all of the criteria for new construction for your ADU and for the house, you could have to replace the septic tank on the existing dwelling or retrofit it with a 2-compartment tank. But that's not nearly as costly as replacing your septic system. So.
Yeah, thank you, Thor. And it's there's always a we get asked this question a lot: is septic, because folks know if they're on one, something has to change. So it was really great that the DEP just lays it out very clearly. Mike, feel free to hop in.
So just a quick question, Thor, what are you seeing as far as towns allowing people to borrow a bedroom from the primary residence? So for example, for my ADU, I had a 3-bedroom house. It was really a 2-bedroom house. So I took that bedroom and was able to put it on my ADU. I feel like that's going to become less and less available, but I was curious as to what you saw.
That's a $1 million question. Thanks I was going to bring that up, but I'm glad you asked it. It can get complicated. It depends on how that bedroom determination is made. I would say, to your point, if you have a 3-bedroom house, most boards of health, most health departments will allow you to remove a bedroom from the house, retrofit a room in the house to make it essentially not a bedroom, and then use that bedroom in the ADU. That, I think, is a path that is allowed in Title V. Some towns are more willing to do that than others. Some towns may require you to put a deed restriction on the primary dwelling, which is very common, especially if you're going from a 3 to a 2, maybe not from a 4 to a 3. But that would be a reasonable request, I think, for most health departments to ask for that, and something we have seen. And then the definition of a bedroom in Title V is different than building code too. So building code may consider, and I'm sorry, Title V's definition of bedroom is more liberal than the building code. So they consider bedrooms to be most office spaces, to be honest. So a family may have a 4-bedroom or even a 4-bedroom building code house, believe they have 4 bedrooms, but in reality they have 5. You know, they have a separate office in their house that they could work with the health department and communicate with them and say, hey, we have this office space. This qualifies as a bedroom technically. You know, we have a 5-bedroom house, but we want to shift it over to our ADU. This does get complicated depending on when a design plan was done. You know, if you know if there was a prior walkthrough from the health department when a design was done, what's on file for that specific property with respect to the number of bedrooms. You know, but these are things we deal with very often, and I think we're finding most towns are willing to work with people on this. You know, most towns are in support of this, but certainly you'll run into situations where they're not and not as accommodating.
That's a great question and great insight. And that's
Yeah,
honestly something
definitely.
we see most frequently is folks know, hey, you know, how am I gonna done a horse trade here? And you know, what do I really have, you know, on my property card physically in my house? And how are we gonna work it through that Title V filter? With
And it's important to note too that the property assessor's card isn't an official bedroom count determination. It's a very common misconception. Some towns will say that's how we're going to determine it, but really it's what's existing in the house. You know, was anything done, you know, unpermitted in the house, you know, that should have been permitted, you know, so there is a little bit of a gray area there. We've seen over the years, each town will handle it differently in terms of how many bedrooms you have.
If I can, just, I'm a little short on time for everyone. Building permits, building permits, building permits. So I've been doing this a long time. 10 years ago, no one gave a fig Newton about building permits. Now they are a burr in everyone's side. I don't care if they're windows. I don't care if you're swapping out a toilet. Make sure you pull building permits, that you close those open building permits, and that you keep your records of your closed building permits. It is just an absolute disaster out there. It's getting better because things, as we move forward, are more electronic, more documented, more. You cannot rely on these towns to keep these records, to follow through. It's imperative for everyone on this call to make sure that they're pulling building permits, that their contractors are pulling building permits. I hear it all the time. I hired ABC Roofer, this reputable roofing company. I had no idea they didn't pull permit. Nope, it's not the builder's responsibility, it's the homeowner's responsibility. And it just makes your head explode because like people just don't understand. Like I hired a plumber, a licensed plumber. Like I'm supposed to be following up on their homework. Like it's ridiculous. But you
We're
gotta
working
do
on a project right now where we might be inheriting some old, not closed out permits that won't impact our ADU build, but they're still open, they're on the property, and they're not closed.
it. That's
And
just
so,
it. It's insane. It's
yeah.
just insane.
Well, Mike, I know you're short on time and you have to run here shortly. So maybe I'll just ask you that crystal ball question.
Yeah, please.
The Affordable Homes Act. Looking into the crystal ball, what do you think is going to happen here in 2, 3, 4, 5 years as it relates to that?
I think again, we're still in the labor process of this. This is still, I mean, this went effective less than, what is it, 6, 7 months ago. This is brand new. And so the opportunities, the challenges, we're still processing, fixing. I can tell you honestly, even a couple months ago, building commissioners honestly had no idea about the law, the implementation. You know, there's just a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of confusion about what towns can and can't do on their baseline. And so as we move forward, I think it's just going to get collectively easier, simpler, more straightforward, more streamlined for whether it's a septic, whether it's a build, and it's just going to become easier and easier.
Great.
I think that's just it.
Great. Well, Thor, we talked about, do you have to run, Mike?
I do. If you want, please provide my contact information. If anyone has specific local questions, something like that, this is my jam. So don't hesitate to reach out to me on this. Same thing. I know, Tim, you and I talked a little bit. I'll follow up with you on that, and I do have to go.
Great. Thank you, Mike.
Nice
Yeah,
to see you. Nice to meet you, Thor. Good luck. Good luck, everybody.
thanks, Mike. So Thor, we talked about, hey, a bedroom conversion. Sometimes that flies, sometimes it doesn't. There's a lot, what's in the ground, what's the system. Other times people are basically building a new system to combine for both. I do get asked sometimes, can I build a separate septic system for my ADU versus my main house and not touch whatever's there? How does that get viewed in terms of Title V?
Yeah, you definitely can do it. The key is that if you are adding flow to the facility, let's say not horse trading bedrooms, if there is an increase in flow on the property, the system serving the dwelling also has to meet new construction standards. So you can have your two separate systems, but if that system that is associated with the primary dwelling is not fully compliant with Title V's new construction standards, it would need to be upgraded to be in full compliance with Title V. Sometimes that's not feasible. In those situations, generally the project would not be doable without a variance to Title V, which is a very difficult thing to obtain. So that would be the path. So hopefully, we do see that pretty often, especially for older homes pre-1995. Hoping that the state and towns can find a way to make that kind of situation a little easier for folks. But right now, that would be the path, to have two separate septic systems on a property.
Great. Yeah, and what I loved about those guidance is it helps homeowners figure out, yes, it is possible. They'll need to bring in an engineer, typically sooner rather than later is a good point of order on that. But what are you seeing in terms of cost implications? I have a bedroom conversion, I have a new system, a combined system, or a separate system. Do you have sort of, how do you help guide homeowners on that?
Yeah, the trouble with cost is that it's very site specific. I'm thinking of Harvard, for example. You have a 7-bedroom septic system with a very high groundwater table. The cost for that system is going to be much larger than, let's say, a 3-bedroom, 4-bedroom septic system with sandy soils with no groundwater. A typical septic installation in good conditions, typically should run around $40,000 or $50,000. But it can go upwards of 100,000 or 120,000 in poor conditions, poor sites, challenging sites, wetlands, stormwater. All of those things can substantially increase the cost, and so we definitely try to give people some help, guidance on that, and it does vary a tremendous amount, and so we always try to be upfront with people and let them know what's coming down the line, and I think you guys do a great job of that too.
Yeah, that's our goal, is try to help get people access to information sooner rather than later, so they can make informed decisions. So Title V, we have guidance. It's not going to be a barrier for ADUs. And I do want to poke you, though. It's not in the Affordable Homes Act, but in general with ADUs, what are you seeing in terms of, you brought up stormwater. And then there's a great question from the audience as well about wetlands and buffer zones. What's out there in terms of for ADUs?
Yeah, so for accessory dwelling units, the state stormwater regulations don't come into play because they're not subject to the state stormwater management standards, but many local communities and towns have adopted their own stormwater bylaws, which is also the same for wetlands bylaws. And those bylaws are not, you're not allowed to bypass those for ADUs just yet. And so what that does is that it triggers a lot of stormwater requirements and potential wetlands permitting for projects in the buffer zone to wetlands. And it varies so much from town to town on what's expected for stormwater. We've had projects where we have to prepare full stormwater reports and fully mitigate for any new impervious surfaces on a property, which can be challenging and costly. But it's just the way these towns are. And so, in our minds, it is very encumbersome, and I don't think it was necessarily the intent of their bylaws to make these projects so challenging for people. average homeowners really, it really does drive up the cost tremendously depending on the town you're in to be able to have to do full stormwater analysis and mitigate for all of the new impervious surfaces with underground storage chambers, surface infiltration basins, rain gardens. There's always a way, but um, for general small increases in impervious areas on properties, 900 square feet, 1,000 square feet, it is a lot of work, a lot of design work on our end to do that. But many towns that do have those bylaws, ADUs are typically subject to them.
And I think that's one thing looking into, what's changed on the West Coast in 10, 15 years. What are we seeing here in New England is some of these other potential barriers that are out there might change as it relates to typically what are, these accessory smaller projects on lots. There's an interesting question out there from the audience. Have you encountered, I know we're veering a little bit away from, the Affordable Homes Act and those changes, but it all relates here to ADUs. And ultimately the goal of that act is how do we help housing production? So this question relates to septics. It says, hey, folks who have challenging situations related to septics, have you seen projects that consider or ask about incinerating or composting toilets?
I personally have not seen that. I know, and I have not dealt with that section of Title V professionally. I know there are some rules around that. I wish I had a better answer, but it's very niche. I don't have a lot of experience with it. I don't know if it applies to new construction standards. It may, but I don't know in my professional experience how it could impact ADUs, increases to flow to existing facilities. Yeah, it's a tricky
So
one. I know that.
it's in Title V. It does exist, and it might be possible, and you need to navigate.
Yeah.
You brought up this section of Title V, and maybe just really quick, like the new construction versus something in the ground. If we're new constructing an ADU and have an existing house, how does that viewed through Title V?
Yeah. So new construction is a phrase thrown around in Title V a lot. There are you basically have to meet all of the standards in Title V for new construction. So that includes property line setbacks, setbacks to your foundation. You have to have 4 feet of naturally occurring pervious material, so material below the topsoil layer. You need to design your system to be fully sized with Title V's requirements. So that is essentially what new construction means. So your ADU, if you're building a separate system, has to fully meet all of those standards of Title V. And without doing that, Title V says, sorry, you're out of luck. You can't build an ADU unless you meet those standards.
So most ADU projects that are getting built probably trigger that. Would a conversion of a basement or a garage, do you think that would also fall under new construction?
I think a town could look at it like that, depending on the age of the system. If it's a cesspool serving a dwelling, they could try to do that. In my opinion, I don't think they're allowed to do that. So the key is there an increase in flow to the system? So if you're trading a bedroom from the house to the ADU, there is no increase. You don't need to change anything other than tying in potentially a new sewer line to the septic tank. And it doesn't require you to do any upgrades to the septic system aside, again, from the septic tank, making that a 2-compartment tank. And then again, that new sewer line from the house or the ADU. So that's where that comes into play. And again, the increase in flow is really the big one, and what Title V points to in terms of whether you have to do new construction or whether you can consider it just a retrofit. And I haven't dealt with that personally, but I know, we had a project again where and we have another one actually too in Topsfield where we had designed a system for somebody. It was an existing house. They had a 3-bedroom house, and I told them, I said, hey, if you guys are ever planning on expanding, you have plenty of room. You might as well just design a 5-bedroom right now. Like, it's not a substantial increase in cost. And they listened, and they did it. They put a 5-bedroom in for a 3-bedroom house, and now they're building an ADU retrofitting a garage to be an ADU and tying everything into that system. So other than a new sewer line to the tank, making the tank a 2-compartment tank, they're good to go. You know, they can march right on forward. But for older systems, you'd need to make sure you don't have an increase in flow, whether that's trading a bedroom, um, and documenting that with the health department.
Great. Yeah, that's really insightful. And when we encounter projects like that, it's like, oh, thank God someone had the foresight, however many years ago, to be prepared, which is great. So there's been this question in the chat for a while, and it's going to require you to put on your wetland scientist hat. And they're asking about wetland buffer zones. They think they have a buffer zone on their property, and how close can they get to that? And obviously, this is just a generalization.
Yeah,
Specific property or town.
Yeah, so it varies by town tremendously. Similar to the stormwater aspect of things, most towns in Massachusetts have also adopted wetland bylaws. So laws that are more strict than the state's Wetlands Protection Act. The state Wetlands Protection Act does not actually have any specific setbacks to wetlands in it. There are setbacks to strictly wetlands. You know, there are other kinds of wetlands that have different setbacks, but just talking about wetlands generally, there's no specific setbacks in the Wetlands Protection Act at the state level. So in my experience, you can get, I've permitted a project that was about 10 or 12 feet from a wetland before. That was the closest I've gotten. It is difficult to argue beyond that you're not having an impact on the wetlands. It was a unique project where there wasn't a lot of room. But most towns, as I mentioned, have adopted a bylaw which typically comes with a no disturb zone from the edge of a wetland and a no build zone from the edge of a wetland. Most commonly, those zones are a 25-foot no disturb zone from the edge of a wetland and a 50-foot no build zone from the edge of a wetland. You know, naturally, someone like me is a great person to just call and say, hey, Thor, you know, what's the deal in this town? What can we do? What can't we do? We get those calls all the time. And again, it varies so much by town. And your local conservation commission would be the best person to perhaps have an informal call with to say, hey, what are the rules here? How close can I go? Generally 25, 50 is what I've seen. Some towns still don't have any in their bylaw. You know, and then when you are in the buffer zone within 100 feet of a wetland, that's what triggers filing typically what's called a notice of intent with the Conservation Commission and Mass DEP. And that's where you get your permit from conservation at the end of that process, and allows work to occur within that protected buffer zone, 100-foot buffer zone.
Great. Yeah, it's hard to answer that specifically without knowing the town, but that's great advice. Pick up the phone, you know, call a professional.
Yep.
If your town has a conservation agent, someone on staff, give them a call. That's their job to help you as a resident navigate that. You could also call Backyard ADUs. We're not the engineer or the conservation agent. And you can also look up your GIS, your town's GIS maps. Check either Mass Mapper or your town's map and see if they have overlays that show, you know, where those wetlands are. And some towns have more advanced GIS and they'll show you buffers. And that would be a good way to at least look and say, hey, what does my town or the state have on file for those wetlands? But if it's not online, you still may have it. So there is some, you know, assessment required. Great. Well, I know we veered in a lot of different directions, but it's all helpful in terms of this palette of navigating, you know, the true, you know, barriers to ADU construction. So if you did have a crystal ball, Thor, you know, the Affordable Homes Act, it's only been around for a year. Most towns didn't adopt the new rules or weren't required to until February. So technically it's been less than a year. Based on what you've seen now, what do you think is going to change or stay the same?
You know, I don't see a lot changing at the state level with respect to Title V or the Wetlands Protection Act. You know, I think if there was one change that I could see coming, it's Title V potentially being more or making it more feasible to ask for increases in flow to existing systems. There may be scenarios where you can do that in the future, to add one bedroom to an ADU, let's say. Again, it's very challenging to do that in some communities, especially where I am on the North Shore. So a lot of properties that want to build ADUs, they just can't because of wetland bylaws, or the fact that you don't have enough soil on your property. And it's very, not necessarily a hardship, but it is a challenge. And I have seen local boards of health. I did serve on my board of health in Gloucester for a while. We really wanted to make it possible for people to have ADUs. And I think the state shares that sentiment. And I think eventually they will try to incorporate something that will allow people to potentially increase flow to existing systems, because very often it can be a win-win where, even if you don't meet new construction standards, you could upgrade a system that's 30 years old, and maybe it doesn't meet the full extent of new construction standards. You're still designing it for, the amount of flow that's coming from the ADU in the house. But hey, like, this is an improvement for the environment. This allows more housing. And so I think that's a change that may come down the road. In my opinion, it's very, very reasonable. And I think, again, the state wants it. And I think it's a win-win for everyone that I hope they eventually will, adopt something to make it happen.
Yeah, and it's time will tell. We'll see as time goes on, and hopefully a lot of those projects that potentially die or can't happen, that information trickles up to the state level, and people realize to say, hey, what are these challenges, because our goals are aligned on helping folks in the Commonwealth with housing.
Yeah.
I prepared a little bit in terms of my answer on the crystal ball, because where we get data from is the West Coast. And we looked California, Oregon, Seattle, states that have had ADU bylaws for 5, 10, 15, sometimes longer. And what I'm basically seeing is these rules will change. This was version 1. Again, really, it didn't start until February that towns were required to have these new rules. But it's going to take time. It's going to take 5 or 10 years for more projects to happen, more information on the ground in towns, to trickle back up to the state level and say, hey, these are the barriers, because the governor's made it clear, and we see it all the time, that the need for housing is there. So I think those lessons learned over time, we're going to see iterations and updates to the Affordable Homes Act. And we're already seeing this here in New England. So Maine is our example, where they passed LD 2003, which was their ADU rules in 2002 or 2022, 3 years ago. And this year they just passed their first revision to that, and have lowered some of the biggest barriers to ADUs. One was sprinkler requirements, which in a lot of municipalities was required, and basically carried around a $15,000 price tag for most projects. That prevented a lot of ADUs from being built. 3 years later, they said we're removing that requirement, which was great. And then there's other layers that they peel back. We had a question earlier in the Q&A that asked about, can they have more than one ADU on their lot? Can they do 2 ADUs or 3 ADUs? This new version of the main law for ADUs allows more density. So it allows folks either who are in a district that wasn't single family to build that ADU. So now I can have an ADU on my multifamily or 2-family property. Or in certain areas, you could build more than one ADU. Right now, the rules in Mass, it's just one ADU per, as long as you're zoned for single family. But the town could allow, more progressive rules. So to truly answer that question from earlier, it will depend on your town. But that is something in the crystal ball of change here in the next 3-5 years or more, as these laws get revisited, as folks encounter challenges. Well, that's where we'll hopefully see the change. And I will plug there, the state is looking for feedback on this So definitely talk to your town, talk to town council, your town planner, tell them what you're seeing, maybe, why this isn't happening. And then that can also trickle up to the ELHOC, the folks at the state who have basically been leading the charge here with the Affordable Homes Act. So it's an exciting time. Thor, do you have it? There's no more questions in the Q&A. We have a couple minutes here. We're right at 6. Are there any final questions for Thor or myself or for Mike? And we can get them to him after the fact. If not, Thor, thank you as always for your time, for your expertise. We'll include your information when we follow up with the recording of the webinar, so folks will know how to contact you. And thank you everyone for spending an hour with us here tonight. And when the recording is ready, we'll send that out and you'll have that in your email. Thank you, Thor.
Thank you, Tim. Nice seeing you.
Good to see you. Have a good evening.
Tim.
Bye-bye.